Between 1980 and 2015, the number of people incarcerated in America increased from roughly 500,000 to over 2.2 million. Today, the United States makes up about 5% of the world's population, yet has 21% of the world's prisoners. Unfortunately, there are many racial disparities when it comes to incarceration. In 2014, out of the total 6.8 million people incarcerated, African Americans accounted for 2.3 million. That's 34% of the correctional population. On top of that, African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites. When also considering incarcerated Hispanics, we find African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately 56% of all incarcerated people, yet only account for 32% of the United States population. If African Americans and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rates as whites, prison and jail populations would decline by almost 40%. One has to ask themselves, what factors contribute to African Americans and Hispanics having higher incarceration rates than whites? Turns out there are many factors that affect the high incarceration rates of African Americans and Hispanics. These factors include education outcomes, unemployment history, criminal history, and the biggest factor that is interconnected with all the other factors is poverty. Research has found that those born into poverty are more likely to be incarcerated and fuel the poverty cycle when they are released. Research done by the Brookings Institute shows that boys born into households in the bottom 10% of earners are 20 times more likely to be in prison on a given day in their early 30s than children born into the top 10% of earners. This means a child could take their first breath and already have a high chance of being incarcerated. But how does poverty tie into race? Research shows that African Americans and Hispanics are the two groups with the highest poverty percentage. While the poverty rate for the population as a whole is 12.7%, the rate varies greatly by race. African Americans have the highest poverty rate at 22%, with Hispanics following closely behind with 19.4%. All the while, whites have the lowest percentage at 8.8%. The poverty rate for African Americans and Hispanics is more than double that of non-Hispanic whites. While the poverty rate has dropped from 13.5% in 2015 to 12.7% in 2016, it still remains high for African Americans and Hispanics. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in 2014, incarcerated people had a much lower median annual income prior to their incarceration, with it being around $19,000. This is significantly lower than the median annual income of non-incarcerated people. Western and Petit found that after being out of prison for 20 years, less than 25% of those released who had not finished high school were able to escape poverty and rise above the bottom 20% of income earners. Less than 25%. This is a far lower percentage than for high school dropouts who don't go to prison. Recent surveys indicate children of prisoners are more likely to live in poverty, to end up on welfare, and to suffer the sorts of serious emotional problems that tend to make holding down jobs more difficult. In turn, this helps fuel the cycle of poverty, leaving little room for escape. There is a direct correlation with a lack of high school education and incarceration, and this is highest among African American men. According to a report by the Hamilton Project, there is nearly a 70% chance that an African American man without his high school diploma will be imprisoned by his mid-30s. There is a 16.6% unemployment rate for African Americans without a high school diploma, showing that men in this demographic have about the same chance of being incarcerated than being employed. There is a higher chance of the people who drop out of high school to go to prison because they don't have the high school education needed to get a higher paying job, resulting in an increase in the possibility of deviant behavior, which leads to incarceration. We see poverty affecting dropout rates as students from low-income families are 2.4 times more likely to drop out than middle-income students, and over 10 times more likely to drop out than high-income students. However, what is very interesting is that the national average for educating a student is around $12,600, while the annual state average cost for housing an inmate is more than double that at $28,000. Another factor in high incarceration among African Americans and Hispanics is one's criminal history. Youth incarceration in the United States is higher than the youth incarceration rate of other nations, and in the United States that rate is highest for African Americans and Hispanics. Unfortunately, one's criminal history plays a big role in the probability that they are incarcerated again. The word recidivism comes to mind, which is the tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend. We find that those who are incarcerated as juveniles are 15% more likely to be incarcerated as adults for violent crimes and 14% more likely to be incarcerated as adults for poverty crimes. As a child has more experience with the juvenile justice system, they increase their probability of incarceration in the future. Juvenile incarceration can have a long-lasting impact on a child's future, as it ruins a child's opportunity for any social interactions and development. It has been stated that incarceration during adolescence may interrupt human and social capital accumulation at a critical moment, leading to a reduced future wages in the legal sector and greater criminal activity. In conclusion, African Americans and Hispanics are two groups with the highest percentage of those incarcerated. This is due to the fact that they have higher poverty rates, higher high school dropout rates, and higher recidivism rates, all which increase one's chance of being imprisoned and fuel the vicious poverty cycle.